Hello, everyone. My name is Ashwini Swain. I'm a fellow at Sustainable Futures Collaborative, a New Delhi-based think tank. Like most of you, I'm interested in our energy future and its implications for the climate crisis. A substantial part of global and national climate action plans hinge on our ability to transition away from fossil fuels, um, particularly. And there's sufficient consensus on the need of this energy transition to clean and greener sources of energy. We are not going to debate that. Rather, it's the construction of our energy history and the resulting projections into the future is now being questioned by some new historical literature around our energy. The optimism on energy transition, particularly human civilization's ability to transition from one source of energy to another source of energy, is argued to be misleading and paints a wrong picture, as alleged, paints a wrong picture of the challenges ahead. And this is focus of the book we are going to discuss. And the book entitled More and More and More, An All-Consuming History of Energy is an interesting book by Dr. Jean-Baptiste Fressoz. Um, so I first got to notice this book through a book review, which called it Sprightingly Demolition Job of the optimism around energy transition. So we have the author to discuss the book, and this is this is what we are going to focus for next 90 minutes or so. And today we have Dr. Fressoz to present this book. Let me first introduce Dr. Fressoz. Dr. Fressoz is a historian of science, technology and environment, a researcher at CNRS, French National Center for Scientific Research, and a professor at École des Ponts et he has authored several books on the topic or related topic. So just to list those, in 2024, he published Happy Apocalypse, a history of technological risk. In 2020, he wrote Chaos in Heavens. In 2016, he published a book titled The Shock of the Anthropocene. And this current book, which came out in last year, More and More and More, it proposes a new history of energy based on the notion of energy symbiosis, which is more apt to describe the past and perhaps the future than all too common notion of energy transition, as we know. And Dr. Fressoz also writes a monthly column in the newspaper Le Monde. Yeah. So to discuss this work, we have Dr. Elizabeth Chatterjee, who is an assistant professor of environmental history at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on history of energy and infrastructure in South Asia from the late colonial period to present. She is currently completing her first scholarly book entitled Late Acceleration, an energy history of India from colonialism to climate change. She has published in American Historical Review and in Past and Present Journal. Her articles cover a range of topics in environmental history, including India's coal dependence, the disappointment of early solar technology, and on dams that cause earthquakes. So with that, I'll now open the floor to Dr. Fressoz, who will present the book, key arguments of the book, and then we'll get into discussion. Dr. Fressoz, over to you.
Well, first of all, I want to really thank Ashwini for organizing all this, and also Elizabeth for agreeing to discuss my book. It's really a great honor to present my book to you. I have a presentation to share. Okay. So basically, the book is an historical reflection on this notion of energy transition. As Ashwini said, it's all pervasive, it's everywhere. I mean, facing climate change, which means, if you talk about the Paris Agreement, it means decarbonizing the world economy between 2050 and 2070. So getting out of fossil fuels, coal, gas, and oil in almost 3 or 4 decades at most. What strikes me is that these future is kind of consensual. I mean, we have to do an energy transition, as Ashwini said, and it is as if we were able to do such a thing. I mean, I think there is a very strong illusion in our capacity to do such a major transformation in a few decades. And what interested me was that history of energy was, has played a kind of discrete but central ideological role in the plausibility that such a transition would happen. If you look at at the at the kind of speeches by politicians, pub, I mean, they all have a kind of history, a very strange history of energy in their mind when they talk about future energy transition. John Kerry, with the US envoy for climate change, said, the energy transition is like a new industrial revolution, as if there was anything in common between the past energy transitions and the future energy transition. You find that also in this idea of a hydrogen economy that would follow petroleum economy, which had followed coal economy. I mean, this is something that you find very often in very like discourse by of boosterism around new technologies. So what I was interested in was this role of history in the discussion about energy transition. That's really what started my interest in the topic. At first, I thought it would be just like a discourse from politicians, not a very substantial discourse. But in fact, you also have this very wrong history in the experts reports. If you take the last IPCC report of 2022 of the group 3, the group which is in charge of finding the solutions to get us out of fossil fuels in 3 decades, you can see that transition is all over the place. Interestingly enough, the issues of sufficiency and degrowth are very secondary in their report. There is very, very little about the reduction of consumption. And what strikes me most is the way they understand history. You can find these phrases: energy transitions can occur faster than in the past, or a low carbon energy transition needs to occur faster than previous transitions. I'm not going to elaborate too much because it is, I guess, completely obvious for every one of you. The past energy transitions are very, very strange. I mean, I don't really know what they refer to. I mean, we have not passed the peak of any energy sources. We have not passed peak oil. Coal is still expanding. And strangely enough, wood is also expanding. I mean, wood energy today is the double of nuclear energy. So we are living with old sources of energy, and our discourse on the solution is really focused on new technologies. So it is from this starting point that I really started to look at the issue of energy transition in an historical way. I think if the experts are talking about transition in the past, it's because they are looking at history of tech. What they have in mind is technological transition. And it is true that technologies do change and technologies do become obsolete. But we must be really careful not to confuse the dynamics of technology with the dynamics of energies and materials. They are very different. If you look at the history of materials and energies, the very obvious point of departure is that all energies and all materials kept growing in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's very difficult to find raw materials whose consumption has decreased in the 20th century. There are very handful of, there are mere a few of them. One of them is sheep wool, which has decreased because of synthetic fiber, but it is the only example, good example of a raw material which has decreased because of an innovation. When I say there is a big difference between history of tech and history of material, the first chapter of the book is dealing with artificial light. And when you think about artificial light, there has been a tremendous technological revolution. Of course, it is electricity. And in the interwar period, all over the world, there is a tendency to electrify lighting. And before electricity, people were using oil lamps, kerosene lamps. After electrification, actually, the use of petroleum to produce light kept increasing. Today, just the headlamps of the automobiles are burning more oil than the world economy at the beginning of the 20th century when everybody was using, or most of the people were using kerosene lamps to produce artificial light. So, I mean, I like this example because it shows the radical difference between history of tech and history of materials. And we should be really, really concerned about the confusion between the two. And I think it's an important point because when we talk lightly about innovation that will solve our environmental problems or decarbonize the world in 20 or 30 years, I mean, we are saying something extremely strange if you take into account history of materials. I mean, the 20th century has been extraordinarily innovative with plenty of new chemical substances coming from organic chemistry. Nevertheless, raw materials keep expanding and expanding. The other reason why experts do talk about past energy transitions, it's also because it is true that history of energy has been written as a history of transitions. This is the main motif of the narratives of the general history of energies. It is a story of successive transitions from one energy system to another. So you've got this idea of an organic energy, a regime, a fossil fuel economy. They can be understood for pedagogic reasons, but they are deeply misleading when you want to think about the challenge of decarbonizing the world. If you take the history of energy, most of the time you've got the same kind of chapters. The first chapters are going to deal about wood and water energy. The central chapters will be about industrial revolution when it's about Europe, and it will be centered on coal and the steam engine. And the later chapters will be mainly about oil and the internal combustion engine. Or you got another genre in the history of energy. It's when you focus on one specific kind of primary energy. So you got historians who are specialized of wood, other who are specialized on coal, other on oil, and they don't look so much at the intersection of these energies and materials. So my book was really looking at the intersection of coal and wood, of oil and wood, of oil and coal. I mean, there are good reasons for historians to have written a story of energy transitions. It's because there were many economic historians who were interested in understanding the root of economic growth. And they also, to do that, they looked at energies in terms of shares. The share of coal in the energy mix of a certain country. It is what they really studied. So you got this very impressive graph coming from a classic book in history of energy, Power to the People. And you can see indeed a kind of transition from an organic energy regime to a coal energy regime in the 19th century in the Western Europe, But this graph, it's not that it is wrong, it is that it is a certain kind of history. It's a history of primary energy. And when you look at primary energy, you don't take into account the extraordinary wastefulness of coal technologies in the 19th century. So I think it anticipates quite radically the importance of coal in these economies because coal was used in, for instance, in steam engine that would convert only a few percent of the chemical energy contained in coal into useful energy. And the other problem is that it tends to erase the fact that so-called traditional energies kept growing and growing in the 19th and 20th centuries. Obviously, hydraulic power has increased a lot during the Industrial Revolution. In France, it has been multiplied by 3, for instance, and in many other countries, it is the same kind of tendency. And this is before hydroelectricity, which of course just expands hydraulic energy radically. If you take wind power has increased a lot during the industrialization, just for navigation, of course, but also for pumping. And terrestrial wind power has increased a lot, especially in Americas. It has these kind of windmills had very, very big importance in the 19th century because they allowed the open up of the Middle West for agriculture. So it's really very, very, very important technology on the kind of global history. And of course, in the 19th and in the 20th century, the muscle energy has expanded a lot. There are more humans, they are better fed thanks to fossil fuels, and they're using more efficient, non-motorized tools. The reduction of friction is a key topic if you want to understand the history of energy, and it's not necessarily high tech. It can be low tech, such as cartwheels, modern wheels are very important to understand the handlings of goods in the industry, for instance. So there are all sorts of so-called traditional energies which are not traditional at all. They're very modern and they're expanding thanks to fossil fuel technologies in part. The other reason why historians of energy have told histories of transition is because they have taken for granted the nature of the energy they are talking about. What I want to say is that they have considered that the statistics of coal are just coal, or the statistics of oil is just oil. But in fact, when you look at coal, coal depends on an enormous amount of wood. So this graphic, a very famous graph from important book, Anthony Wrigley, Energy and the Industrial Revolution. When you look at this graph, it seems that firewood, has disappeared in Britain in the middle of the 19th century. And it is true that in Britain, people did not warm their houses with wood, and all the steel industry had already shifted to coal. But in fact, the coal that we are talking about is consuming more and more wood. At the beginning of the 20th century, Britain used 4.5 million cubic meters of pit props, timber mining, to extract coal. And if you take the calculations made by my colleagues, Britain in the 18th century would burn an average of 3.5 million cubic meters of firewood. So just to produce its energy, Britain used more wood in the form of pit props than it did in the 18th century. So this idea of an escape from an organic economy is problematic. I mean, in fact, Britain used more forest in the 20th century to produce energy than it did in the 18th century, because to produce pit props, construction timber, you need 4 times more area of forest than to produce firewood, right? Because the rotation are longer. And I mean, this is, for instance, the Cardiff Harbour in 1936. As you can see, there is a lot of wood, and it's just the pit props for the mines of the whales. And the story of Britain is just one case. All the industrial countries in the 20th century used more and more timber mining until the 1960s. And the most spectacular case is the USSR. In 1965, it used around 25 million cubic meters of pit props. And it's because there was one canal which was inaugurated between the central Russia and Ukraine, which allowed the transfer of a massive amount of timber from central Russia to Ukraine. So it is this kind of symbiosis between energies, regions that we have to study if we want to understand properly the history of energy. So basically, the first chapters show that really without wood, there would have been very little coal, so almost no steel, no steam, no railroads, and so on and so forth, right? I think it has some importance even to understand, for instance, the famous Great Divergence. I'm not an expert on the history of energy of China, far from that, but I just noticed that US and European engineers who were active in China at the beginning of the 20th century kept explaining that there's an awful amount of coal in China. It's not the issue, but there is no easy accessible timber to extract all this coal. So, I mean, it might be an important factor to take into account. Wood and coal should not be understood in competition. They're in symbiosis. The story of industrialization is not a transition from wood to coal. It's a different story. It's the symbiotic expansion of wood and coal. You can say exactly the same thing about coal and oil. I mean, it's probably more obvious, but oil is mainly used to power automobiles in the 20th century. And to produce an automobile, you need a lot of coal. In the 1930s, uh, automobile factories use 7 tons of coal to make a car. That's why the biggest raw material entering in the production of a car is coal, and it is still the case today. I mean, if you take a life cycle assessment of the Chinese automobile industry, it's around 3 tons of coal to make an automobile in China. So it's better, of course, because there's been a lot of technological progress, but it is still a big amount of coal. So the automobile is as much an oil technology as a coal technology. And it's even worse than that because all the infrastructure of the oil industry depends on steel, and steel is mainly produced with coal. Some calculations are made in the interior period explaining that oil was a very important stimulant for coal. In Britain, for each ton of oil that was burnt in the interior period, 2.5 tons of coal was needed to produce the infrastructure used for the oil industry. And of course, once you got oil, I mean, all raw materials become cheaper because the distribution of raw materials is much easier. And it is especially the case with coal. Before the advent of the dump truck, uh, distributing coal was very expensive and cumbersome. And so therefore, the dump truck really reduced the cost, the economic cost of coal, for instance. The same kind of stories work very well with oil and wood. One of the big transformation of the world energy scene from the 1960s onwards is the expansion of charcoal in the poor world. Charcoal in sub-Saharan Africa has been multiplied by 6 since the 1960s. It is the first time in the history of humanity that you've got very large cities like Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam, Lagos, with using mainly charcoal to cook. If you take figures for Kinshasa, it's around 2.3 million tons of charcoal that is burnt every year for the city. Paris in the 1860s was only 100,000 tons. 100,000, yes, tons of charcoal a year. So one large city in sub-Saharan Africa is actually probably more wood than France at the end of the 19th century. You know? So there, I mean, charcoal is certainly not a kind of outdated technology, and it is perfectly clear if you look at the report on the topic. I mean, they are even talking about the charcoal transition around the year 2000, explaining that you have to just modernize charcoal. The idea that there will be a quick transition out of charcoal to modern energies such as electricity was seen as very dubious. And the fact that with increasing growth and urbanization, charcoal was expanding is, I mean, very obvious for any specialist of energy in Africa. But I mean, perhaps more surprisingly, you've got exactly the same, not exactly the same, but a similar phenomenon in the rich world. If you take the consumption of wood energy in the US or in Europe, it has increased a lot in the 20th century. One of the reasons is because there is an industrialization of wood. So the industry of wood panels and even more of the paper industry consumes more and more wood energy. And here you can see that this symbiotic relationship between energies can expand very far away. I just give you one example. With economic growth fueled by fossil fuels, you got more and more goods to package, so you need more cardboard. So the paper industry is growing quickly in the second part of the 20th century. And it is around 1960 that the paper industry succeeded in using what they call black liquors. It is the liquid part of liquid residue from paper production. These black liquors, I mean, they represent more energy than solar panel in Europe, for instance. So we're talking about a serious quantity of energy. So in this case, you've got really an expansion, economic expansion driven by fossil fuels, which creates more demand for wood energy at the same time. And probably the best example of the fact that energy transition is certainly not a good historical category is the case of Drax power plant. Drax power plant is a coal power plant in Britain. It's quite famous in Britain because it has been converted to biomass. Biomass means actually wood pellets extracted from US and Canada mainly. The important point is that Drax burns at least 4 times more wood than Britain in the 18th century. So after 2 centuries of energy transition, we reached this fantastic result that Britain is using at least, and it's much more actually, 4 times more wood energy than it did in the 18th century. And all this wood energy produces only 1.5% of British primary energy, which means that, this idea of trying to use biomass to have the same kind of energy services that we have with fossil fuels is really doomed to failure. It won't work. There is not enough biomass to do that. And you've got the same problem with sustainable aviation fuels, which are very popular right now in the discussion around climate change and aviation, saying that we just have to use vegetable oil to power airplanes. But the quantities of vegetable oil are minuscule compared to the quantities of kerosene. So when you tell the history of energy like this, not as the history of successive energy transitions, but rather as a history of symbiotic expansion of all sources of energies, the obvious historical question is how come that energy transition has become so prevalent, has become so consensual, whereas it is a very strange notion? I mean, one thing to have in mind is that it is a fairly recent phenomenon. For a very long period of time, experts looking at energy dynamics did not even mention the word energy transition. And they rather saw the future as an expanded present, not as a very different present. You can have an easy confirmation of that just looking at conservationist literature of the 1960s. They were asking questions such as, will there be coal in the US in 2 or 3 centuries? So, I mean, they were really, conscious about the fact that energies are not changing so fast. So this is really how experts in general thought about energy and energy future, more like an expansion of everything rather than a very, very big change. And there is a small group of people who started to talk about energy transition. They were atomic scientists from the US. Most of them came from the Manhattan Project. They were kind of horrified by Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they were also amazed by the quantity of energy that you could get from the atom if you had the breeder reactor, the fast neutron reactor, a specific kind of reactor that never really succeeded. It's not the fission reactor that as we have nowadays. It's a different kind of reactor. And as soon as 1943, there are calculations made about the enormous quantity of energy that you can get out of it. And it is key in terms of ideology because it opens a kind of infinite horizon, infinite energetic horizon. Actually the scientist who coined the word energy transition is Harrison Brown, to my knowledge, to the best of my knowledge. And energy transition at the beginning is a term of nuclear physics. It is a change of the status of an electron around its nucleus. So he's probably recycling a kind of technical terms of atomic physics to talk about the future of energy. And he's mixing this word with another very famous notion at that time, which is demographic transition, which is important for the new Malthusians, people thinking about population growth and all the problems connected with population growth. And Harrison Brown is part of this milieu of atomic scientists belonging to the neo-Malthusians intelligentsia. Another key scientist is probably Marion King Hubbard. Marion King Hubbard is the famous theoretician of peak oil, but in 1955 was recruited by the Atomic Energy Commission. And he became a very important cog in the lobbying machine of the Atomic Energy Commission. He wrote reports for the Kennedy administration explaining that you have to finance generously the breeder reactor program because it is a key topic for the survival of the human race. It is about the future of industrial civilization. And as you can see in this very spectacular graph, I hope that the presentation is working, but I mean, in the lower graph, there is indeed a kind of energy transition, but it takes place in a very, very long period of time, over a long period of time. All fossil fuels make a narrow peak because it is contrasted to the infinite energy plateau that you can access given that you have the breeder reactor. And of course, the time scale is striking. I mean, it is 10,000 years. So over a 10,000 year time scale, indeed, all fossil fuel at the rate of US consumption or world consumption around 1950, it doesn't last for so long. I want you to look really closely to the lower graph. As you can see, the end of fossil fuels, according to Marion King Herbert, at a global level, is in a faraway future. It's in 4 or 5 centuries. In the US, it can go quite fast because there is not so much petroleum and nuclear power will be quickly developed. But at the world scale, they know that coal is very abundant, and they know that it is going to be difficult to develop nuclear power everywhere in the world. So the energy transition is thought as a very slow process. And in the last part of the book, I'm interested in how come that this very strange futurology, this idea of a complete shift from one energy to another, which is very radical and contrary to all the dynamics, all the past dynamics, how come that this futurology became our futurology facing climate change? The reason is really to be found in the 1970s. In the 1970s, there is, of course, a very important topic which emerged, which is the idea of energy crisis. Energy crisis, the word itself, is probably linked to also kind of nuclear agenda. But the important point is that the idea of energy transition became widespread as a solution for the energy crisis. Everybody started to talk about energy transition to describe all sorts of technologies that would solve the energy crisis. But energy crisis in the US is understood as a problem of energy sovereignty. So energy transition is a very wide encompassing notion where you can put all sorts of technologies which increase the energy sovereignty of the US. So it can be the liquefaction of coal, for instance, to produce oil. It could be more coal. It could be nuclear plants. It could be a pipeline in Alaska. It could be solar panels, whatever, right? It's a very wide encompassing notion. Probably the reason why we are all talking about energy transition today is one discourse given in April 1977 by Jimmy Carter. And I was really interested in this discourse, which was already noticed by a fellow historian called Lucio Bazzosi. I was interested in this discourse that you can find in YouTube because Jimmy Carter makes a kind of history lessons. He says that in the past, there have been 2 energy transitions, one from wood to coal, the second from coal to oil, and now we're going to do a 3rd energy transition. And actually he's commenting on this graph, which you can find in the US energy plan that he's talking about on the TV. Of course, this graph, the trick is to put everything in relative shares and to put wood. It's a very original representation of energy dynamics. Normally, energy dynamics would be represented using this kind of graphs. And of course, it's not the idea of transition that comes to your mind if you look at this graph. This graph is probably more powerful to instill this idea of energy transition. And what interested me was that this graph was stolen from Cesare Malchetti. And Cesare Malchetti is an important intellectual for the energy transition. I will go quite fast, but I think his writing have played a role in naturalizing this idea of energy transition. Cesare Malchetti is an Italian atomic scientist. He is obsessed with hydrogen because hydrogen is the key for the nuclear energy to become an important energy. Otherwise, atomic energy is limited to the electric market. So it has to really displace oil. And to do that, you need to produce hydrogen. And Cesare Malchetti in 1974 joins the IASA. The IASA is another important institution to understand the history of energy transition. IASA is a forecasting institution created near Vienna. It's an East and West initiative, a détente of the period of the détente. And they become really one of the major center for energy forecasting and energy modeling. And I mean, until today, they remain very important for the IPCC Group 3 modelers, energy modelers. They are really the key institution which organized this whole discipline, new discipline of net zero modeling, right? And at the YASA, people are already using computers, just like modelers are doing now. They're using computers to show that a soft energy transition is possible out of fossil fuels in 50 years. And Cesare Malchetti is very critical of that. And he used history and historical data to show that energy transition are very slow. They exist, but they are very slow. And I mean, he created this famous graph of energy waves, where you can see energy sources, which seems to be substituting one with each other. He has been very criticized by Václav Smil, an important energy historian, because, of course, as you can see, coal did not disappear as Marchetti had envisioned by 2020. On the contrary, coal has remained very stable in terms of shares and that expanded in terms of absolute values. But this critique is kind of unfair because Cesare Malchetti was criticizing people and his colleagues who were far more optimistic to the capacity of humanity to get out of coal. So, I mean, the very disturbing morale of this small story is that one of the most pessimistic forecasters of the 1970s turned out to be far too optimistic about the speed of the evolution of the world energy mix, right? Anyway, it is in this kind of milieu that this idea of looking at energy in terms of shares and not in absolute values, and to imagine energy system as a kind of dynamic system became kind of common. And then this idea of energy transition became very useful to reflect on climate change. I mean, the reason why energy transition became so common, it's because the same experts were active during the energy crisis. They were economists, energy economists, who employed themselves at refuting the Global Forum report. And then they became the major climate economists. And they used the same kind of reasoning. I just give you one famous example. It's William Nordhaus, a famous US economist who got the Nobel Prize in 2018 for his work on climate change. And it is very clear that you got this transfer of futurology from the energy crisis to the climate crisis. In 1973, William Nordhaus wrote a paper about the time allocation of energy resources in the US. The issue is the growing price of oil. And the question is, should we try to conserve oil since oil is getting scarcer and more expensive? And his answer is quite counterintuitive. It is no. We have to extract oil now while it is expensive, because in the future, at the end of the 20th century, we will have the breeder reactor, and it could make oil obsolete. So we have to use oil now while it is useful and expensive. 2 years later, he's writing the very first paper by an economist on climate change, and he makes the same kind of reasoning. There is the issue of greenhouse effect. Does it mean that we have to reduce oil and coal consumption right now? No, it's better to wait, because at the end of the 20th century, it will be much easier to do a transition to the breeder reactor. And he's not alone explaining that. I mean, Alan Mann explained that, a colleague of him at the YASA, waiting for the breeder is the good solution, the right strategy. So the energy transition in this milieu of energy modelers, economists, was really a kind of justification for procrastination. It's better to wait, to be easier to make the transition later. Important people said this is rubbish. It won't work. I can come back to that later. I don't have the time. But nevertheless, they got the upper hand. He got the Nobel Prize, not the critic of Nordhaus. And then the energy transition was very useful for the oil companies who really love this idea of energy transition. I mean, there is a very interesting discourse in 1982 by the head of R&D at Exxon, who said that, of course, there is climate change, but the interesting question is what will come first, the climate catastrophe, the climate disaster, or the energy transition? And it's very astute to present the thing that way because climatologists themselves were convinced that an energy transition would take 50 years, with almost nothing to substantiate this argument. I can come back to that later, but there is a singular naivete or, not very serious argument to explain that it takes 50 years to make an energy transition. We don't know how long it takes to make really an energy transition. We have never done one yet. And then lastly, the energy transition was very useful for governments, and especially for the US government at the beginning of the international diplomacy around climate change. And then you've got very interesting archives from the US and discussions between George Bush's chief of staff, John Sununu, and Robert Reinstein. Robert Reinstein is the head of IPCC Group 3. And he's also the US envoy at the Rio conference, the 92 Rio conference. I mean, the conference that funded all the UN system around climate negotiation. And it's very clear in the discussion between the two persons there that energy transition is just a rhetorical device. It's a diplomatic tool. John Sununu said, okay, to Robert Reinstein, he gives his order in a way. So you're not going to accept a treaty that would constrain US emissions. So no targets. We're not going to pay for damages or anything else, because that's really what for them, Robert Reinstein is climato-skeptics. Which seems strange for a head of group of the IPCC, but he's not believing in climate change. So we're not going to pay for anything. This is what all this climate issue is, according to them. It's for poor countries to ask money from the rich world. So play the technology card. And play the technology card was really what the IPCC Group 3 has been doing for 30 years. If you look at what all these reports are about, they're mainly about technologies. It's really the overwhelming topic. It used to be nuclear, which was important. Nowadays, it's more renewables. It's hydrogen. I haven't put hydrogen, but hydrogen is every other page with the word hydrogen in the last IPCC report. And now it is about CCS, carbon capture and storage, and carbon dioxide removal, non-existent technologies that are supposed to save the beans after 2050, because we have not been able to do this famous energy transition. Now we're going to pump CO2 from the atmosphere and bury it under the ground. And it has taken an enormous role in the net zero scenarios nowadays, right? Okay, so now if you, at the end of the story, of course, it's what is happening now? We are certainly not, in a energy transition right now. If you look at forecasters and the report of the International Energy Agency, they don't see any energy transition coming. They talk about energy transition, but what they see is hopefully a decrease in coal, thanks to renewables, thanks to solar panels, mainly. But gas and oil, is more or less, it's going to stabilize, right? But it shouldn't be surprising that we don't succeed in doing this energy transition, because energy transition is a very strange notion. It's not a very serious notion. It's not a scientific notion. What we are doing with renewables and with electric cars in a lesser extent, we reduce the carbon intensity of the economy. We don't do more. We're not shifting from one energy to another. That's too simple. Energies are completely intertwined. It's very difficult to disentangle all the energies. So, I'm really concerned by the fact that energy transition has played an important role in just, going on as before. There is an issue with climate change. Let's do an energy transition in 30 years. This is probably it's not the right way of framing the issue. And thanks to energy transition, all the issues about reduction in production and redistribution among social classes, among nations, can become secondary, because thanks to energy transition, you can imagine a world with growing economic economic growth in the faraway future that would solve all these issues of poverty and redistribution. So I think it has played really a very, very damaging role in the climate discussion up to date. Okay, I will stop here. I hope everything was clear.
Thank you, Dr. Fressoz. So this is very useful insights. I have a few questions, but before that, I would request Dr. Chatterjee to comment on the work and add a little bit of Indian context to this. So then we can get into discussion. Liz, just before you, I would request the participants to put down their questions in the Q&A section. We'll take up those together after Liz's remarks.
Yes, thank you so much, Jean-Baptiste. This is a fascinating book and a huge contribution, I think. If anybody needs any other reason to go out and buy the book, I should say, I think it's great value because you really get two books in one, as you heard. You get a very interesting history of energy since the Industrial Revolution, and you also get a wonderful genealogy of this very problematic concept of the energy transition. I think for energy history, energy historians like myself, one of the biggest provocations of the book is the idea that we need to move past obsessing over the very visible fuel sources at the front end and start thinking about as well energy as embodied in things like steel production, concrete and cement production. And for me, one of the big through lines actually is the importance of the chemical industries as fertilizer production, paper, and so on are revealed as enormously important consumers. And on the other end, there's something very depressing about the fact that this quite goofy concept of energy transition has actually been taken up by so many other disciplines as a master concept. But I would just love to ask you a little bit about the causal story that underlies this. So I'm very persuaded by the descriptive finding that new energy sources never displace old, or almost never. And they're not only added, this is not only an additive logic, but they often amplify the use of the old source. But I'd just love to hear a little bit more about this concept of energy symbiosis. So what creates a symbiosis? How does this work? Is it that, we have producers looking for new markets, say, as their dominance is threatened? And more broadly, what are the drivers of this intensification over time? Have they remained broadly the same since the 1800s? Obviously, we've seen massive geographical shifts, say, in energy consumption over this period. So I'm just very interested in the causal logics that explain symbiosis, and I suppose more and more and more in general.
I mean, to be frank, the book is very poor on causal explanations. I mean, it's really, I wanted to have a very materialistic vision on energies. And I was a bit skeptical about recent attempt to, propose a kind of political history of energy. I devote a chapter on Tim Mitchell's book, Carbon Democracy, which is pragmatic in many respects. But I don't have a better proposal to really put forward. I think it's basically economic development and economic development, which means more roads, more cars, more of everything. And then there are technological reasons why you don't make steel using hydrogen and you use coal to make steel. It is much cheaper and much easier. And I think we have to, respect the technical difficulties and not imagine kind of easy solutions out of that. I mean, I was amazed by the quality of all the expertise produced by engineers in the 20th century. I mean, they know a lot about the material constitution of society. We have to read them. But I mean, some time ago, when I was younger, I wrote a book called The Shock of the Anthropocene, and there was a chapter called Capitalocene, and rightfully you criticized this book, which was a kind of Yeah, I was a bit young and probably a bit naive, but I mean, all the Capitalocene, you can reframe that with development. You're entirely right, and I totally agree with that. I mean, it's and in a way, this idea of fossil capitalism is problematic itself because capitalism is fossil, is organic, it's renewable. It is, I mean, everything basically. And I think it is founded on the very wrong idea that of green capitalism. You know, that there would be a green capitalism and a fossil capitalism against a green capitalism. All this is far too Manichaean and simplistic. The energies tends to be completely intertwined, as well as the capital, actually. Nowadays, among the biggest renewable producers in Europe, there are fossil fuel companies. You know, it's anyway. So the root cause of that, of the symbiosis, is mainly technological. I think that's really we have to take into account the I mean, basically to extract coal in the 19th and 20th century, you didn't have so many choices compared to wood. I mean, Britain tried to use steel, but it was more expensive. And it is only in the 1960s with very elaborate powered roof system, very complex machines that you could escape from this dependence of coal and wood. So that, I think if you want to, I did not really make a theory out of symbiosis. But there are two parts in the symbiosis argument. There is the symbiosis on the production side, so all the energies and material you need to produce an energy, and then the symbiosis on the consumption side, all the material and energies that are involved in the consumption of one particular energy. The most obvious case is, of course, with renewable energies. Today, you can imagine you can power automobiles, electric automobiles, but an electric automobile is still a big chunk of coal. So it's not really a zero emission technology, obviously. So, I mean, you could distinguish between, yes, production side and consumption side. I just noticed that the consumption side is much more important in history. What I want to say, what I mean here is that, for instance, the use of timber to extract coal is small compared to the fact that coal stimulate the consumption of wood for railroads, for construction, for paper. This is much bigger, and we got exactly the same thing today with renewables and fossil fuels. I mean, you need some fossil fuels to create the wind turbine, the solar panels. It's not nothing. It's 50 gigatons to replace all the coal power plants and gas power plants. I mean, it's a very theoretical number, but with solar panels and wind power. What is much more important is all the coal and oil and gas to produce the automobiles, the cement, the road, the continuing expansion of infrastructure, the steel. This is much heavier in terms of CO2 emissions. So we have really to talk a lot about consumption. I think on the consumption side, we really need to think about that in a much more serious way. If we want to do something about, limiting, certainly not stopping climate change, but delaying it.
Yeah, I think that the idea of seeing production and consumption in the same lens and the way that you're arguing is hugely important. And recognizing that energy transition is not from one source to another, but also involves all sorts of ramifications further down and transportation of energy, but all the way through different consumer sectors. I'm very persuaded by that. Are there examples where there are a few, I suppose, in the book of where symbioses seem to have come apart a little bit? The very famous example is, of course, whale oil. That's also whaling intensifies right up until the 1960s, but we see whale numbers rebounding. And then you suggest that the wood-coal relationship, of course, did start to come apart a little bit, though maybe it's at Drax and so on. It's just recalibrating. But can we learn anything useful about the way that some of these symbioses fall apart if we are interested in limiting consumption?
I don't think that history can give us any hint about what we should do. I mean, honestly, what we have to do is beyond historical analogies. So I don't want to play the role of the historian who is going to teach lessons. Actually, what I did was completely the opposite. I thought that the historical literature was not at the level of, life cycle analysis, of, expert production on the dynamics of energies. So it was rather this way around. I mean, the case that people had not looked at pit props in the history of British industrialization is striking. No, it's strange. I mean, it is obvious. It's completely self-obvious, and nevertheless, there was nothing on that. And the same thing with oil tubes. I mean, oil tubes are extremely important and steel, so they are made of steel and coal. So, I mean, I think it was, so, I mean, yes, the example would be coal that is no longer dependent on wood, even if probably you still have underground mines that are still using wood. I mean, it has not disappeared, but with open cast mining, of course, you don't need so much timber, obviously. But it's a very limited example. I mean, I don't think you can learn anything, except that it would take a lot of time. I mean, because it is only in the 1960s that really coal started to disentangle itself out of timber. I mean, one very depressing thing is the case, indeed, that producers of raw materials always succeed in finding new markets for their products. And the case of wood is very good for that. I mean, wood is still used to produce energy, but you got access to so much more wood thanks to railroads, and then thanks to trucks and forestry engines. But it can be repurposed to paper. Paper production is expanding thanks to packaging mainly. So yeah, I mean, I think once again, it's not a very joyful book. I'm sorry, I don't have good, like history tells us that we can do it. I don't think history tells us that. Yeah.
Oh no, I think that it's very tricky for everybody to end on an optimistic note, as I suspect an editor in the US would have really pushed for some jolly solutions, but this is not a book that leads us towards those. Just thinking as well about, I think one of the great strengths of the book is it synthesizes an enormous literature across multiple languages. There are nearly 100 pages of notes here, and it is much more genuinely global than many such histories. If in particular, drawing attention to the role of China in now creating 30% of annual emissions. But that also raises some interesting questions, I think, about how this travels. You note, for example, that Chinese coal mining, much of it is semi-informal, and for wood has always substituted very dangerous labor. India would have something similar in certain areas of the northeast, sometimes called rat hole mining, little artisanal mines, say. So that begs the question of how much you think these techniques are shared across the world. I mean, really, I'd invite you to say something here as well about Europe is quite smug of the idea that it leads the world in decarbonizing, and you have a nice parallel account as well of European actors as globalizing certain forms of technique as well.
Yeah.
So how much is this, a genuinely global story, and how much do we see, say, regional patterns that differ?
I mean, it's very generous comment, because it's not, I say very little about India, very little about China, but it is true that basically China and India are they are using coal in the same way as US did in the 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I mean, it's not so different, and it is global because the technological world is global, basically. I mean, there are two or three ways to extract coal, and you find them all across the world. But indeed, I right in the introduction, there is this very self-gratifying narrative in Europe, in Western Europe, because we've got nuclear plants or wind power, that we are getting out of coal. And you find that in the press, in the British press in particular. Britain consumes less coal than in 1746. It's a recent title of the Guardian or something like that. This is rubbish. I mean, British way of life is completely dependent on steel and therefore on coal. And then, of course, they have shut out their last blast furnace, but they're importing steel. Or when they use steel, it's secondary steel, but it means that they are recycling scrap steel, but it means that people will have to produce more primary steel elsewhere. So this is a very, very misleading understanding. And I try to quantify the amount of coal in the import of Britain or France, for instance. It's around 50 million tons, I think. It's difficult to know, the exact number, but 50 million tons, it's still a significant figure. I also give the example of Switzerland, which is a fascinating case because, of course, it's a very wealthy country that emits very little CO2 compared to its GDP. But Switzerland is a home of Glencore, which is really a leading company in mineral extraction and of coal in particular. And it's also the home of Trafigura, a not very well-known company, which specializes in trading of raw materials and coal in particular. And if you take the two, it's almost 1 billion tons of coal, which in one way or another is traded or influenced by decisions and makes money for Switzerland, and it's quite a lot for an 8 million inhabitant country. So you can multiply these examples, but seeing Europe as being in advance is very problematic, because as any rich country, they've got a huge trade, and this trade is mainly powered with at 1/3 basically with coal. So why did I say all that? No, I think one more perhaps original thing that I said about that is, the British coal board or Charbonnage de France. They seem old-fashioned and they have disappeared because, of course, coal mining has stopped in both countries. But actually, around the 1990s, they were extremely modern. They had the best technologies for underground mining, to the extent that the US experts they sent missions to see what was happening in Europe, in Western Europe. And at the opening up of China, they were the companies selling the modern mining equipment to the Chinese mines, sorry. Well, of course, nowadays, Chinese mines are using proprietary technologies and they're not relying on. But still, Europe is a big exporter of mining equipment, which I think is quite strange given the very weak mining industry that there is in Europe. Anyway, so it's really the idea is to get out of this good, bad, Europe being in advance, and so there are many problems about this framing. Yeah.
Very interesting stuff. Well, turning to the concept of energy transition then. I was just thinking that I think perhaps part of its appeal is that transition maybe for John Kerry is different from transition for, say, Marchetti. And that is a slipperiness in the concept that is it an intransitive or transitive verb? Is energy transition something that just happens and you just throw your hands up and wait for societal innovation, et cetera, to carry us forward? And this is, of course, what past transitions have looked like, at least nominally. Or is energy transition something that's intentionally engineered and that demands a role for the state and so on? This is sometimes talked about as, currently we are looking for the first planned transition or directed transition. Which does demand, roles for regulation in theory. So I just wondered if you think there's something to this slipperiness that means that quite different groups can get aboard with this, some which completely are pro-deregulation and others who would like to see, say, massive amounts of state activism behind this.
Yeah, no, you're right, and we should be careful not to confuse between the two views of energy transition. You're entirely right. It's different to say that energy dynamics, they are marked with energy transitions, and to say that we have now to do an energy transition and whatever it costs, we have to do it. It's, of course, a very different political position. Nevertheless, even in the kind of more positive and more, positive action to engage to make an energy transition, even like this, I think it is problematic because the very notion itself is really too too unsubstantiated. Even with the very good will, I think it is extremely difficult to make really an energy transition, and we won't be able to do it. So I think it's even the word energy transition tends to orientate all the discussion around technologies, because sometimes I got people objecting that, oh, but with energy transition, actually, we are talking about degrowth. No, no. Frankly, it's because energy transition was used really not to talk about that, not to talk about demand. It was really used to talk about a shift in technology. So I think we should really get rid of this notion, really. But you're right. I mean, there are different kind of political flavor in the energy transition discourse. Yeah. But I think the Marquette's argument was that even if people would want to do the energy transition, it would take a lot of time. And I also want to point out that companies have tried to economize coal and oil all the time, and they have already been hugely successful at economizing fossil fuels. One example that I found striking was, experts writing in the 1930s showing that with electrification in the industry, you divide by 10 the carbon in the CO, the coal consumption of the industrial force, because you get rid of all steam engine and you replace them with electric motors, and they're much more efficient. So, and coal was expensive during the First World War and right after the First World War. So there was a very strong incentive to economize coal. And nowadays, with renewables, you divide by 10 the carbon intensity of electricity compared to a gas power plant, to a modern gas power plant. So, yeah, I think we've been here before. There's already been a lot of technological progress behind us. And what we have nowadays with cheap solar panels is not that revolutionary. It's part of the history of technological progress, and it won't lead us to net zero, quite certainly.
Well, there are lots and lots of questions, so I'll keep myself to just one more. I do think that it's amazing, as you point out, that the transition thinking has had so many critics all the way along and has proved so sticky nonetheless, has defeated all opposition. But just zooming out to your book as a whole, you conclude by telling us you've given us a material history, and in many ways you have, but with this very interesting history of ideas attached. So I'm interested in what the relationship is between those two things. I could have imagined a book about energy intensification that said, look, this is the long list of obstacles on the material side. And instead you give us an obstacle on the ideational side. Again, I'm just very interested in what you think it would do to tackle the problem of transition talk. Once we've got that out of the way, do you think some transformations on the material side then follow? Or is it more that it's a distraction, it's a sort of effervescence that we get all worked up and talking about whether China is the biggest player in renewables, say, and we take our eye off the material ball. So, where is the real thing that we all should be working ourselves up on and maybe working on?
Once again, I think this book won't change much, and it's not. We have to be really modest about what we can do, I think. But what I hope the reader will be convinced of is that we have to talk about the carbon intensity of the economy, because it is really. What we are doing is reducing the carbon intensity of the economy, and why is it important to present a thing like this? Because it leaves on the table the size of the economy. Dreaming of a zero CO2 economy in 20 years is really stupid. It will never happen. There are many good reasons that it's easy to see why it won't happen. I haven't talked about agriculture in this book, but agriculture is completely dependent on fossil fuels, and it won't be disentangled from fertilizers, from plastic, and from all sorts of from pumping water before a very long time. So let's stop talking about this ghost, and let's have a serious discussion about what is the usefulness of certain CO2 emissions. And recently I've discovered that there is a whole branch of ethics, not economics, but ethics on luxury CO2. Of course, people have thought about that, but the economists, like the people who write the IPCC Group 3 reports, who are influential in the climate discussions, they haven't talked about that. I'm amazed that economists don't have a kind of theory of saying this CO2 is very important for the welfare of the population. This CO2 emission is certainly not that important, and you can start by cutting that out. No, I mean, basically, the economists have worked under what they call the Pareto optimality situation. So you cannot increase the welfare of someone without reducing, you cannot reduce the welfare of someone. I mean, so there are really big issues about equality that have not been dealt with by economists, and they have been far too confident on the technological solutions, and they have written really ridiculous things about hydrogen, about CCS. This is scandalous. This is really a scandal. So I hope that the book tries to instill a bit of technological modesty also in what is doable and what is not. I think the key thing is to really differentiate between what we can achieve and what is not achievable, and focus on what really we can achieve. And probably decarbonizing electricity is something which is achievable, difficult but achievable. Decarbonizing everything is not possible.
Well, I think you're too modest about this book and what it will do. I would say definitely it's causing quite a stir over here in the US. So I hope it's begins to transform this conversation.
Well, thanks a lot, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Liz. I just wanted to put one more question to both of you, actually. So I'm quite convinced by reading the book that we need to, while thinking about energy transition, 21st century energy transition, as they call it, we also have to think about our material dependency. So decarbonization goal is incomplete if we don't think and plan for the material dependency. But how I see it slightly different in 19th century and 20th century, the focus of energy transition was to find more accessible and efficient energy sources and driven towards more energy security of the society or economies. But in 21st century, we have a conscious effort to decarbonize. And particularly in the last 10, 15 years, the emphasis and the technological advancements make me a little optimistic about the future. While I am quite convinced by your interpretation of the history, I mean, we and our ability to make transition as a human civilization. What do you think? Does this emphasis on decarbonization will help the society and economies to transition to cleaner sources faster? I mean, I'm not talking about to put a 10 or 20-year timeline for that. So I also don't believe in a precise timeline, but will it enable more, at least faster transition in the current era?
I mean, basically, I think, of course, it's better if you try to do something, even if it's, I mean, something very difficult. It's better if you try, and it will, I mean, probably will reduce CO2 emissions. I mean, in Western Europe, even if we are still importing a lot of products made out of coal, in fact, indeed, the CO2 emissions, even taking into account the importation, has decreased. Not that much, but it has decreased. I mean, there is technological progress, but I mean, I'm not sure there is so much policy about really being serious about CO2 emissions. I mean, I know a little bit about France. I mean, as soon as we start talking about anything reducing the interest of anyone, there is a kind of it is blocked. It's incredibly difficult to talk about, even like reducing the speed on the highways, reducing meat consumption. It is very strongly opposed, by not necessarily by the population, but by the government. What strikes me is like in 3 years ago, there was a kind of citizen assembly where random citizens were put together and they were instructed by experts. Well, it seemed a bit naive, but nevertheless, their decision, their report was very good, actually. It was, prohibiting advertisement for automobiles, reducing the speed on the highways, reducing meat consumption in the schools. I mean, of course, it's not going to reach net zero with this kind of decision, but still, it's like a first step, But it was completely overruled by the government, as far too radical. Even prohibiting aviation in cities which are connected by fast trains, like the TGV. I mean, even that was not possible. So I think there is very, very little political will, actually, very little. We keep talking about it, but I mean, the government is not going to do more than what is possible with the technology, obviously. And I don't want to be pessimistic, but what is happening in the US and what will probably happen in certain countries in Europe doesn't make me optimistic either,
Liz, do you have anything to add on this?
Just very quickly, I would completely agree with Jean-Baptiste's diagnosis and pessimism, I think, sadly. I think in this way that he's describing, the conversation in places like the US, much of Europe, looks less radical than it did in the 1970s about the willingness to actually alter behavior on an everyday level. And I'd just say, I mean, decarbonization, it's definitely a rhetoric that does something, but where it tends to advance, it's where it also can be bundled together with other kinds of pushes. So whether it's the idea that renewable energy will also bring national security, or whether it's the idea that it will allow for, more decentralized and flexible energy provision in rural communities. And it's this kind of argument about, say, co-benefits, famously in the Indian context, where I think it tends to progress furthest, and it gets almost no traction in places where decarbonization would be very difficult. And the other side of this is the green capitalism that Jean-Baptiste briefly mentioned. I think this shows really that the system is perfectly well able to accommodate talk of decarbonization without actually any fundamental change to the underlying logic of intensification. So there, sadly, I think the book has converted me to thinking that we shouldn't be too taken by what seem to be big rhetorical shifts.
I just wanted to add on what you just said. I mean, I was struck indeed by in the 1970s, the elite or certain part of the elite was really scared by the oil shock. I mean, it's really kind of rocked them. At the EU Commission, the vice president of the EU Commission in 1972, right after the Club of Rome report, wrote a very interesting letter to the president of the commission saying that we have to change everything. I mean, we really have to have completely different set of values. In the US, the Ford Foundation in 1974, which is like center left, I mean, it's not a radical thing. I mean, the Ford Foundation, it's close to Carter administration at that time. The Ford Foundation made a very interesting report explaining that it is illusory to dream about an energy transition. And it takes the example of nuclear energy, which has been subsidized quite intensively by the US government, and it's very marginal in the energy mix of the US in 1974. So we have to change the value of US citizen. Stop dreaming about more material consumption and more about leisure, about health, education. Well, it's very well-meaning, of course, but nevertheless, there were and it's about taxation. We have to have a proper fiscal system to shift all these values. So there were very interesting reflections in the 1970s, and from nowadays they seem very radical, even from a European perspective, which is not exactly the same as the US now, but it seems extremely left-wing, compared to what we have nowadays.
I'm picking up a few audience questions before we wrap up. So one question is, if the way we know energy transition is a controversial concept, and if we wish to move away from that, what would be an alternative narrative or more accurate narrative to offer to the climate action goals or moving away from fossil fuels?
Okay, so sorry, I think I'm not really trying to invent a new word because it's not my job. Basically, it's what I said. It's about what we are doing is decreasing the carbon intensity of the economy, and I think that it's not a very nice phrase, but it's what we can do. It's what we should aim at. Yeah, sorry for that. I don't have a better notion to propose, and I would be skeptical about someone coming with a brand new word and saying that it's going to really help us so much.
Yeah. So there's another question around nuclear. So, and also in the policy space, nuclear seems to be getting back into the conversation. Um, and what's the hope around that? Will nuclear be able to transform the narrative significantly,
I mean,
and particularly material dependency perspective?
Nuclear energy is good to produce electricity, even if it has drawbacks about residues and so on, but it's just doing that. I mean, from nuclear then to make fertilizer, to power airplane, to produce steel, there are several technological steps. Most of them rely on hydrogen, which is very cumbersome, and there is very little demand for using hydrogen because it's very impractical to use. So I'm quite skeptical. And the other thing is nuclear is very slow to install, very expensive. So yeah, I mean, China is investing a lot on nuclear, but they're investing on everything else as well. Yeah, we shouldn't be dreaming about a nuclear world. I mean, that's I think not really what is coming. And anyway, it's not a global technology. I mean, there are very few companies able to build nuclear plants. There are 5 or 6 of them in the world. Yeah, so yeah, we don't. I mean, it won't play a very, very major role in the next decades.
And finally, there's a question I want both of your reaction on this one. Do you think the rhetoric of transition, particularly the one around clean tech, is it a form of resource extraction from the poorer economies? Um, and it's from audience.
Okay. I was really interested in this idea that you need a lot of metals to make the energy transition, which is something that you find very often in the expert reports and in the press right now. Actually, around the year 2000, there were several reports from EU countries or the US explaining that we have to ensure a kind of sovereignty on metals, on minerals. And it was because of the rise of China, which was becoming a very major actor in, of course, mineral extraction all across the world. After the Paris Agreement, after 2015, the very same report made by the same experts on the same kind of minerals became, we need minerals to do the energy transition. So there has been a kind of rebranding of mineral extraction as the key for an ecological world. So it was a very kind of astute way of, kind of greenwashing the extractive industry. Of course, we need metals to build wind powers and so on, but in fact, most of the metallic extraction will not be used to produce renewable electricity. It will be used for domestic appliances, for automobiles, for construction, for airplanes, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I would just say that I think in so far as transition rhetoric is absolutely status quoist, it of course perpetuates the inequalities of an extremely, well, firstly, unequal system in terms of resource extraction, but also the inequalities of where climate impacts will be felt first. But I would say, though, that that does not mean that we should let governments of poorer economies off the hook entirely. I think they have an awful lot of agency, or more than is often admitted. So in some ways, we could say it's the elites, maybe in countries like India, are collaborating in this kind of transition talk as well. I don't think this is just emanating, say, out of Washington or Paris and being forced upon the rest of the world. It clearly is doing different kinds of work in different places, but broadly, I think that Tanya in the audience is right to suspect there's something fundamentally unsettling and extractivist about it.
I have a question actually for the audience or for you, Ashwini or Elizabeth. I don't read the Indian press, I should actually, but is the word energy transition very in use in India, even if, because India, I think, is increasing its coal extraction right now. Is it something that, we are doing coal extraction, but like in 20 years will be decarbonized? Because I know they have got the 2070 goal as a net zero, which is quite amazing when you think about it. I mean, what is the political use of is Modi using this word energy transition or?
Well, if I can quickly give my opinion on that. Of course, the energy transition narrative has been used for the potential opportunities in that. And India is not particularly looking for displacing fossil in immediate run. So rather, the goal is energy self-sufficiency by 2047. And we have set ambitious targets around all forms of energy, from modern RE to nuclear, including coal as well. The goal is to reduce import dependency. Of course, there's a 2070 target. So while I agree with what Liz said about developing countries having more agency and India sort of leading that, but often in the conversation, in the policy discourse, we also look up to the developed countries, what path they took in terms of their energy trajectory. And Liz, you have also written about India's late acceleration in terms of fossil expansion as well. So given that, I mean, if you have any last words for what India can particularly, the way India can approach it, that would be helpful. So we'll take last round of words, then we'll wrap up with closing to that.
I don't have sorry, I don't have any message for, I don't know anything about energy. I'm very little about energy in India, so I'm not there having really a message about how they should approach it. But I think, yeah, I mean, if you understand that the history of energy has played a very dubious ideological role, that it has projected a false history on a future that really remains to be invented, and that the issue of redistribution is absolutely key, and I guess especially in India, where there are very strong social inequalities. That's what climate change should be about. The globe is going to warm. It is sad, but it's really what comes from the study of recent history, and it will be easier if the use of CO2 and the welfare associated with CO2 is more socially widespread and better redistributed. Sorry, it sounds very nice and cheesy, but it's the only thing I can find.
Well, that's very useful. I mean, that's the key. Liz, if you have any last words, otherwise.
Oh, I definitely can't top that. I find that not cheesy, but very powerful. I'd just say that I think reading this book with a lot of care is inspirational in many ways, because it gets away from trivial slogans like not just energy transition, but electrify everything, say, and starts pressing us to really look seriously at different key sectors. So whether it's fertilizers, whether it's what is powering tube wells, whether it's thinking about, where paper comes from and packaging and things like this. So I think it actually cracks open a whole range of areas where interested scholars and activists can begin pressing for really quite meaningful changes in a serious way. And in that way, I actually see it as really shifting us onto a real 21st agenda that's just beyond looking at, say, the composition of the electricity sector into thinking about the economy much more profoundly. So I'm very grateful, Jean-Baptiste, that you've put this together.
Thank you very much, Isabel.
No, thank you both very much for this interesting discussion. So I would just add to what Liz said. In Indian policy discourse on climate and energy, we often hear about how countries like India have to leapfrog, tunnel through, or bypass certain technological trajectories. And this book is really helpful to understand what we need to bypass or what we are aspiring to bypass or leapfrog. So with that, we'll end this. And thank you both very much for your inputs.
Well, thanks again. Thanks a lot.
It's been a privilege.